was ordinary, the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to happen. Rows of identical houses lined the streets, each with its neatly trimmed lawn, its mailbox standing like a sentinel at the curb. It was quiet, predictable, a place where people felt safe. But something was wrong. At first it was just a feeling, a vague sense of unease creeping into the mind of Ethan Graves. He had lived in the neighborhood for 3 years, working a dull office job, leading an unremarkable life. Yet, lately something about the street felt off, like a puzzle with a missing piece. He couldn't quite place it, but a peculiar disquiet had settled over him, something shifting just beyond the edges of his perception. It wasn't until a late-night walk that he finally saw it, the house that shouldn't be there. It stood at the end of the cul-de-sac, an old, rotting Victorian structure, completely out of place among the modern suburban homes. Its windows were dark, empty sockets staring into the night. The paint was peeling, the wood swollen and cracked from years of exposure. The yard was an overgrown mess of dead grass and twisted weeds. A single, rusted swing hung from a tree in the front yard, creaking softly in the breeze. Ethan stopped in his tracks, his pulse spiking. That house had not been there yesterday. He was sure of it. His mind scrambled for an explanation. Maybe he just hadn't noticed it before. Maybe he had simply overlooked it. But that wasn't possible. He knew every house on this street. He had driven past this very spot every day. He had walked down this road countless times. And yet, there it was, looming, silent, wrong. An icy chill crawled up his spine, a deep, instinctual sense of dread whispering in the back of his mind. Something about the house repelled him, like an unseen force pushing him away. The logical part of his brain urged him to turn around, to go home and forget about it. But he couldn't. The next morning he stepped outside and nearly dropped his coffee. The house was gone. Where it had stood, there was nothing but an empty lot, overgrown with weeds. No sign of disturbed earth, no remnants of a foundation. Nothing. It was as if the house had never existed. Ethan blinked hard, trying to process what he was seeing. His stomach twisted. Maybe he had been imagining things. Maybe he had been half asleep last night, his mind playing tricks on him. But then, as he walked down the street, later that evening, he saw it again. Only now, it was 3 houses down from where it had been the night before. He felt the blood drain from his face. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. The house was moving. Each night it appeared somewhere new. It would stand in one place, old and abandoned, for a few hours. Then, by morning, it would be gone, only to resurface in another part of the neighborhood. No one else seemed to notice. No one talked about it. Ethan tried to ignore it, tried to convince himself it was just some strange illusion. But the house didn't let him forget. It followed him, always lurking at the edges of his vision, watching. And soon he realized it was getting closer. Ethan couldn't ignore it anymore. The house was moving, not just shifting around the neighborhood, but getting closer, creeping toward him like some silent predator. He tried to convince himself that it was some elaborate prank, that maybe he was losing his mind. But deep down, he knew the truth was far worse. One night, standing on his front porch, he decided to prove it. Grabbing a can of red spray paint from his garage, he walked up to the house, where it now stood, just 2 lots away from his own home. The air around it felt wrong, heavy, like the stillness before a storm. He could feel its presence pressing down on him, his skin prickling as he approached. He hesitated at the edge of the cracked sidewalk, staring at the warped wooden steps leading up to the door. Then, with a deep breath, he stepped forward and sprayed a large red X on the rotting front door. The sound of the paint hissing from the can was deafening in the still night air. When he was done, he stepped back, heart hammering. If the house disappeared again, he would know for certain that something was happening. That night he barely slept. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. The silence of the house was suffocating. Every little creak and groan sent his pulse racing. By morning, he rushed outside, his breath catching in his throat. The house was gone. Ethan hurried down the street, scanning every yard, every vacant lot. And then he saw it. The house now sat on the opposite side of the street, its old frame towering over the pavement. And the red X was gone. His stomach twisted. Had someone painted over it? Had the house itself erased the mark? The thought sent a shiver through him. That night he tried again. He placed objects, stones, sticks, even a small pile of dirt around the foundation, marking the ground beneath the house. He took photos comparing them against the daylight. Every morning the house had moved, and every morning the marks were gone. It was as if the house never stood in one place at all. The realization sent an icy terror through him. It wasn't just moving, it was undoing any proof that it had ever been there. And worst of all, it was getting closer to his house. Ethan's paranoia grew. Each night he would watch from his window, staring at the house's shifting form, feeling its unseen presence creeping ever closer. One night, he noticed something new. A light, a dim, flickering glow from one of the upstairs windows. His breath caught in his throat. The house had never shown signs of life before, only darkness. But now, there was someone inside. For hours he watched, unable to look away. The light flickered, shifting like candlelight, shadows moving behind the grimy glass. Then, as he strained his eyes to see who or what was inside, a shape moved into view. A figure, tall, faceless, its outline barely visible against the dim glow. And then, slowly, it turned its head toward him. Ethan stumbled back from the window, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His mind screamed for him to leave, to run, to get out of the neighborhood entirely. But something held him there. Some deep, unshakable certainty that the house would follow him no matter where he went. The following evening, the house stood directly across the street from his own home. It had never been this close before. Its rotting wooden door faced his front steps, like a predator crouched, waiting. That night, Ethan locked every door and window. He sat on the couch, his hands gripping his phone, debating whether to call someone. But who? The police? A priest? Who would believe him? At some point, exhaustion overtook him, and his eyes fluttered closed. For the first time in days, he drifted into uneasy sleep. But when he woke up, he was no longer in his house. Ethan woke to complete darkness. His body was stiff, his breath shallow. The air was heavy, damp, wrong. For a moment, his mind refused to make sense of his surroundings. His bed, gone. His familiar bedroom walls, gone. The warmth of his house, gone. Instead, beneath him, the floor was cold wood, splintered and uneven. The air smelled of mold and decay, thick with dust. He wasn't in his home anymore. He was inside the house. Panic surged through him, adrenaline flooding his veins. He scrambled to his feet, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The darkness was suffocating, stretching endlessly in all directions. He reached out, his fingers brushing against something rough, peeling wallpaper, damp and crumbling under his touch. The floor creaked beneath him as he took a hesitant step forward. A noise, a faint whisper, stirred in the air around him. Ethan froze. The whisper wasn't coming from a single place. It surrounded him, slipping through the walls, curling around his ears like unseen fingers. The words were indecipherable, a low hissing murmur that made his skin crawl. Somewhere ahead, a light flickered. A candle. Its dim glow barely reached the walls, casting jagged, shifting shadows. The flame did not flicker naturally. It shuddered as if something unseen was breathing over it. Beyond the candle, a hallway stretched into darkness. And then, the whispering stopped. A new sound took its place. Footsteps above him. Slow, deliberate, heavy. Something was upstairs. Ethan's heart pounded as he crept toward the candle's faint glow. The walls seemed to close in around him, narrowing the corridor, the ceiling pressing lower. The house was breathing. With each step, the floor beneath him pulsed, expanding, contracting, as though the entire structure was alive. The candle's flame shivered violently. From above, the footsteps grew louder. And then, a door creaked open. Ethan's breath hitched. The sound came from the top of the unseen staircase, just beyond the reach of the candle's glow. Something was watching him. The air turned thick, pressing against his skin like invisible hands. His vision blurred, the candlelight stretching unnaturally, shadows twisting into shapes that should not exist. Then, a whisper, right behind him. A voice, low and rasping, so close that he could feel the cold breath on his ear. "You're home now." Ethan spun, his pulse hammering against his ribs. Nothing was there, but the house had changed. The hallway behind him was gone. The walls had shifted, closing in. The only way forward was deeper into the house. His breathing quickened. This wasn't just an abandoned building. It was a trap, a living thing, and it had caught him. The footsteps above moved again. This time, they were descending the stairs. Ethan bolted. He ran blindly, following the shifting corridors. But the house did not let him escape. Doorways appeared and vanished. Walls stretched and closed. The candle's flickering glow twisted, throwing monstrous shadows along the warped wood. And then, suddenly, he was in the living room. The fireplace loomed in the darkness, cold and ashen. The furniture was rotting, covered in dust and torn fabric. And across the room, a mirror. It stood tall, its surface fogged with age. But as Ethan approached, the mist cleared, revealing his own reflection. Only, it wasn't quite him. The figure staring back at Ethan's face, but the eyes were empty sockets, mouth slightly open, breathing, smiling. And then, it stepped forward, not in the glass, into the room. Ethan stumbled back as his reflection emerged, a warped, hollow mimicry of himself. The thing had no eyes, just yawning black voids that sucked in the light. Its smile stretched too wide, its movements too smooth, like a puppet with its strings freshly cut. Behind it, the walls bled darkness, the shadows unraveling into countless grasping hands, reaching, twisting, pulling. The thing tilted its head, that awful smile widening, and then it spoke, in Ethan's own voice. "You were always meant to be here." Ethan tried to scream, but the shadows surged forward, swallowing him. He fell, not onto the floor, but into something deeper, into the house itself. The neighborhood was quiet. The sun rose, casting soft light across the street. Everything was just as it had always been, except the old Victorian house was exactly where Ethan's house had been the night before. No one noticed, No one questioned it, and inside, through one of the grimy upstairs windows, a shadow moved, watching, waiting for the next visitor to arrive.